68 years ago today, General Dwight Eisenhower gave the final order for the Allied invasion of Normandy. It was the eve of D-Day. Among the Americans who fought to liberate Europe in the months ahead was First Lieutenant Billy Harris. And that brings us to Steve Hartman's On the Road, part mystery, part love story.
Peggy Harris of Vernon, Texas, never got a knock at the door. Never got a telegram, never got anything definitive explaining what happened to her husband Billy during World War II. And so, in the absence of answers, she has remained dutiful to this day.
Billy was married to me all of his life, and I choose to be married to him all of my life.
Peggy and Billy got married just 6 weeks before he got shipped off to war. A fighter pilot, his last mission was July 17, 1944, over Nazi-occupied northern France. Billy never returned from that mission.
At first, he was reported as missing. Then he was reported as alive and coming home. Then Peggy got a letter saying he'd actually been killed and was buried in one cemetery. Then another letter saying he was buried in a different cemetery. Then she was told maybe those aren't his remains at all. For Peggy, it was very frustrating.
And so I waited longer.
Months turned to years.
And still no answer.
Turned to decades.
So I wrote to my congressman.
Wrote repeatedly, asking for any information about the fate of her husband. The last letter, in 2005, was directed to Representative Mac Thornberry of Texas, who also happens to be vice chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. In his reply, Thornberry said Billy was still listed as missing in action in the National Archives.
Didn't feel it was right that he just went off to war and didn't come back. End of story.
Billy's cousin, Alton Harvey, grew up with this mystery.
You need to know what has happened to him.
So, a few years ago, he decided to try and get to the bottom of it for Peggy. He started by requesting Billy's military records. And that's all it took.
I said, that can't be. It never dawned on me he was there.
Few missing soldiers have ever been easier to find than Billy Harris. Here in Normandy, France, at the world's most famous cemetery, along its most well-traveled path, the answer has been lying all along, clear and sobering as a white marble cross. So why then, as late as 2005, was Peggy's congressman still telling her that her husband was missing in action? Turns out, there are no records of Representative Thornberry ever even checking with the National Archives. And if he had, as we did, he would have seen, it says, right there, KIA, killed in action. Thornberry didn't want to talk to us. And for her part,
who knows?
Peggy harbors no grudge.
Have to learn to be forgiving.
She's just glad to finally have an answer. Since learning her husband was buried here, Peggy has been sending flowers.
Valentine's Day.
10 times a year she sends flowers.
His birthday.
Making this, by all accounts,
wedding anniversary.
The most decorated grave in all of Normandy.
Christmas.
Cemetery officials say she's also, as far as they know, the last widow who still visits here. After 60 years, she's clearly got a lot of mourning to make up for.
When people speak of closure, they are people who haven't experienced anything like this.
Acceptance. Peggy says at this point that's the best she can hope for. And these visits help her get there.
Yeah.
Plus, she says, after just 6 weeks together as husband and wife, and more than 6 decades apart, any time together is a treasure. Steve Hartman, On the Road, in Normandy, France.
Peggy has discovered that the people of one French town have loved and honored her husband almost as long as she has. Tomorrow, on the anniversary of D-Day, Steve will take us there. That's the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News all around the world, good night. On this anniversary of D-Day, we continue our story of one of the American soldiers who fought to liberate France from the Nazis, First Lieutenant Billy Harris. As we told you last night, it took his widow 6 decades of battling bureaucracy to learn his fate. But it turns out that his death was just the beginning of an amazing tale. Here again is Steve Hartman with On the Road in Normandy, France.
It's now been 67 years since the liberation of France, but at today's D-Day ceremony in Normandy, there was one woman who's still in mourning. In fact, until recently, Peggy Harris of Vernon, Texas, didn't even know her husband Billy was buried here, and certainly didn't know the story I'm about to tell you. Billy was a fighter pilot, shot down and killed in July of '44 over Nazi-occupied northern France. But because of a series of snafus, miscues, and miscommunications, that information never got to his wife. As far as she knew, Billy was just missing.
How many years did you wait?
All my life.
Peggy never remarried, never moved on, and might never have known the whole story if a relative hadn't looked into his military records a few years ago. The surprise wasn't that he died. Peggy had come to assume that. It was what came after.
Here in the tiny Normandy town of Levant, the main road is actually called Place Billy D. Harris. It's the same road the townspeople have been marching down 3 times a year for the past 60 years, in part to commemorate his sacrifice. How much does Billy mean to them? Just listen to the mayor's voice when she gets to reading his name on the monument. That's how much.
Hello, Peggy.
And by extension, that admiration now goes to his wife.
So happy to see you again.
Since learning her husband crashed near here, Peggy has been making an annual pilgrimage. She visits the nearby woods where the plane went down, escorted by 91-year-old Guy Surlot, the only witness still living. Guy said Billy was able to maintain control of the plane despite his condition and avoid the village. A hero in death. At first, they buried Billy in their local cemetery, covering his grave with flowers knee-deep. Even after his body was moved to the American cemetery at Normandy, the town continued to take flowers to his grave.
How can I not be grateful and hold these people very dear?
The people of Levant say they just wish they could have done more. If only I was able to help, Guy said, to which Peggy responded, "You did."
I like to think that he was still conscious enough to know that a friend stood by him. And that this man was that friend.
Her gratitude is matched only by theirs. In Levant, the American sacrifice is still very much treasured and honored.
So we don't forget.
They don't forget.
And now that we know the story,
They don't forget.
neither will we. Steve Hartman, on the road in Levant, France.
And that is the CBS Evening News for tonight. For all of us at CBS News all around the world, good night. A lot of you have called us about Steve Hartman's story this week, about First Lieutenant Billy Harris, a U.S. airman who never came home from World War II, and his widow's quest to learn his fate. As Steve reported, the office of Peggy Harris's congressman, Mac Thornberry of Texas, told her back in 2005 that her husband was still listed as missing in action. But it turns out Lieutenant Harris was not missing at all. He'd been shot down in France in 1944, and he's in the American cemetery in Normandy. Today, on his Facebook page, Congressman Thornberry said he has sent Peggy Harris a personal apology for the mishandling of this sensitive matter and for any distress she has suffered as a result.